The CCP virus has again mutated, and a new strain found in Malaysia is allegedly 10 times more infectious. The Chinese regime has been using torture to force confessions from prisoners of conscience, and a group of NGOs that conducted a review of this practice is now calling on the United Nations to act. And a new clean plate program recently launched in China is being viewed as another sign of a looming food crisis. And the whole city of Chengdu, which is the capital city of Sichuan Province, is now partially underwater amid the ongoing floods sweeping across China. Water levels in the city of Chengdu are now 2 stories high. Hey, welcome back everyone. So first off, you might remember this recent episode where we talked about how people were receiving these unsolicited packages of seeds coming from China, and now people are receiving unsolicited packages of face masks. Well, guess what just came in the mail? We got 2 packages of what appear to be these face masks. One of our colleagues got them in the mail. They were not ordered. They showed up randomly. So you see I'm wearing gloves. We'll be going over these now, so let's see what's in them. So first off, this was the one she opened. It says untracked. It's from Guangdong Province. It says description of contents is wire connectors. Now if you open it up, there are 2 different stacks of face masks inside. I looked inside, there's nothing else in here. Now this is the one that's already opened. Let's have a look at the one that is not yet opened, and we'll be doing that now. So first off, this is sent through China Post, through the United States Postal Service, and it comes from Shanghai. Again, unsolicited package, showed up randomly at our door. No idea what's inside it, folks. We'll have to figure out. So let's get started. All right. Now, again, these were not ordered by my colleague. They showed up unsolicited. Yep, here you go, face masks. Nothing else appears to be inside the package. No powder or anything. And let's see here. So, Ziploc bag, face masks. Nothing appears to be strange about them. And yeah, so strange phenomena happening across the U.S. And again, one of our colleagues here received these 2 packages. This one was unopened. The other one she did open. They had wire connectors written on the package. This one actually does say face mask or disposable masks on the package. This one sent from Shanghai. The other one sent from Guangdong. So no idea what's going on with these. We're going to be passing these to the relevant U.S. authorities, and we'll see what goes from there. We'll keep you all updated on that. And now that said, let's jump into the news updates for today. So first off, a new mutation in the novel coronavirus, the CCP virus, that's estimated to be 10 times more infectious, has been discovered in Malaysia. Now, the mutation has already begun spreading and was traced to a restaurant owner who returned from India after breaching the required 14-day quarantine. Now, the man has been fined and sentenced to 5 months in prison. But reports say the virus strain was already found in people returning to Malaysia from the Philippines as well. Now, the news, a Chinese amphibious armored vehicle sank while it was being tested. The state-run TV channel CCTV released a video on its YouTube channel, CCTV Records. It was meant to show the regime's military, but a scene showing one of its amphibious armored vehicles sinking into the Yangtze River drew ridicule instead. Now, the video showed the vehicle launched from the Chongqing section of the river. It first turned on the water, then began to accelerate. Then unexpectedly, about halfway through, the vehicle plunges into the water. Its personnel abandon the armored vehicle, and it sinks to the bottom. Now, after the video started facing criticism, Chinese Communist Party officials came out and said the video was filmed 20 years ago. But netizens are questioning this, especially wondering why they would only release the video now if that were the case. Meanwhile, reports are saying that the smartphone division of Chinese telecommunications company Huawei is running out of options on where to find its chips. Now, it was able to identify 5 potential global suppliers, but each of these would also have serious challenges, ranging from restrictions on the U.S. sanctions on Huawei to questions of whether or not the available chips could actually compete with current generation technologies. Now, among the options on the table are to outsource to other companies, but even this would likely run into problems with the US sanctions. Now, for example, it would use the Chinese company SMIC, but since it uses US equipment to make the chips, SMIC would be unable to supply them to Huawei. Now, the quality of its chips are also far behind Taiwan's TSMC in terms of capabilities. Now, the plan was to have chips made with a 7-nanometer process, what Huawei is planning to do, which is one of the most advanced techniques in chip manufacturing. Now, Huawei is now looking to downgrade that to a 5-nanometer process, and even this may be beyond its capabilities. On August 10th, China's SMIC addressed concerns from its investors and whether the company could still produce the Huawei chips despite the bans. The company said it's required to follow the laws and regulations. Now, this is a likely hint the sanctions could prevent the development for Huawei. And this brought criticism from the investors, who are now accusing SMIC of not siding with China and instead complying with the United States. Now, in addition to this, the iPhone manufacturing company Foxconn has declared China's days as the world factory are done. In other news, China is preparing for a possible cutoff from the US dollar. This is part of ongoing sanctions. And this is pushing the CCP to more rapidly attempt to create an alternative currency. Now, according to Reuters, some economists are pushing the CCP to only accept Chinese currency with its new CCP virus vaccines as it begins sending these to other countries. Others are taking a more hardline stance. Yu Yongding, an economist at the state-backed Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told Reuters that a broad financial war has already started. And he said, quote, "The most lethal tactics have yet to be used." Of course, the CCP has long been accused of waging financial war on the United States. It just so happens that one of the main voices on this, Peter Navarro, who is the co-author of the book Death by China, is now a top Trump advisor on how to deal with the Chinese Communist Party and its various tactics in this regard. Other experts in China, meanwhile, are warning that the CCP needs to be prepared for additional U.S. sanctions and to brace for more direct sanctions on its financial institutions. This is similar to what has already been done to Russia, for example. Now, in Latin America, meanwhile, the United States is beginning to push back against the CCP's campaigns for influence and its use of debt traps. In a call with journalist Michael Kozak, acting Assistant State Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, said the United States is giving advice to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to be careful on financial offerings from China, warning that the CCP could use these to seize their assets and hit them with debt. Now, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said, according to Miami Herald, that, quote, "It is not like the Western countries, which is, if there's a bad debt or a bad loan, it gets worked out, or something is paid off over time. The Chinese come in and they will take a port or take a railway if a country is in debt to them. In other words, the CCP will seize hard assets. It will seize infrastructure." And meanwhile, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is continuing his global tour, talking to countries about the CCP's influence. On Sunday, he visited the Dominican Republic, where he met with the country's president. Pompeo had stated previously that the United States and the Caribbean nations can do much more together and should do much more together. Now, he referred to them as natural allies and natural partners and declared, quote, "Now is the time to move forward with even closer ties." And this happens as the CCP is embarking on its mask diplomacy campaign in Latin America. Now, Beijing has donated at least 150,000 masks and a batch of PPE, this personal protective equipment, to Brazil. It also donated medical equipment such as ventilators to Peru and Argentina. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the Chinese Communist Party often forces confessions from prisoners of conscience after torturing them, then airs their confessions on state TV. And now a group of NGOs, including human rights organization Safeguard Defenders, is calling for a United Nations review on how the practice violates international rights and laws. Now, the 11-page submission details 87 forced confessions, and it describes how the televised confessions are fabricated. Among the methods, it says, are dressing detainees in costumes, heavily directing what the individuals say, and through deceptive editing and other means. Now, it's common for the CCP to use torture to extract confessions, And the report notes that this has been well documented by human rights organizations, by scholars, and even by the CCP itself, which accepts the practice. It concludes that there is, quote, no doubt that the CCP's televised confessions are gross violations of Chinese law and of international human rights. And it states they are almost indistinguishable from Mao-era struggle sessions or show trials of Joseph Stalin during the Soviet Union. It states, quote, there is also no doubt that they are staged, written, and directed by the police with the cooperation of the media, and that China is using these televised confessions as a propaganda weapon for both domestic consumption and as a foreign policy tool for an overseas audience. It also notes this, quote, the fact that media collaborate does not just reflect a shocking lack of journalistic ethics, but constitutes direct culpability. Now, what are we seeing here? This organization is going to the United Nations to try to request them to investigate and possibly bring charges against the Chinese Communist Party. The problem with that, however, is the Chinese Communist Party pretty much runs the show in the United Nations, including on the Human Rights Council. Now, we've repeated previously, going several months back now, an investigative report by the Epoch Times by a journalist named Alex Newman. Now, he did some investigations into the Human Rights Court at the United Nations and found some pretty shocking things. There was a case, he noted, where different whistleblowers from China were set to come out and talk to the United Nations. They were going to reveal human rights abuses by the CCP. The United Nations took the names of those people, gave them to the Chinese Communist Party, and the CCP then arrested them. One of those individuals actually died in CCP custody. And then in addition to this, the United Nations took the whistleblower, the person who tried warning about this, and made her stand trial in a United Nations tribunal. Now, the use of torture, beatings, persecution of family members, and other tactics, these are all common practice by the Chinese Communist Party. It's not uncommon, for example, for an individual coming out and criticizing the CCP, if they're Chinese, to have their family members back in China threatened. The Chinese Communist Party does many of these things openly, and it's only very recently that it's being called out on this on an official level. And the Chinese regime, on that note, is facing backlash when it comes to countries, including the United States, bypassing the United Nations to sanction CCP officials directly. And so again, they're going around the United Nations to go directly at these Chinese Communist Party officials, charging them with sanctions for their abuses of the Chinese people. Now, in other news, the Chinese regime has launched a new Clean Plate campaign against food waste. This follows a public statement from CCP leader Xi Jinping that we reported on previously. Now, the state-run news outlet Xinhua had run Xi's statement, calling on Chinese citizens to stop wasting food, and included a warning about food security. Now, as the CCP rolls out its new Clean Plate program, it is also using its state media to claim there is no food crisis in China. Now, at the same time, however, state news outlets have begun criticizing Chinese citizens, have been posting popular videos of themselves eating large amounts of food. It's apparently a popular thing in China. Now, restaurants are also being encouraged to limit the amount of food served to diners. This includes regulations that if there's a large group of people, the restaurant must serve one less dish than the number of people in the group. Now, despite its claims otherwise as well, data does suggest that China will face food shortages this year. Now, this follows rumors of food shortages even during the height of the pandemic. You might remember the leaked documents that were warning about food shortages and caused panic buying in China. And now, in addition to this, China is facing crops that are being destroyed by floods, droughts, and by locusts, as well as reports of food spoiling at storage facilities. Now, based on public reporting by state media and from local government branches, the Epoch Times estimates close to 300 million people in China may face food shortages this year. Now, what does this all mean, right? Typically, whenever the Communist Party stresses or reinforces something, it means there's a problem in that area. But it won't openly admit problems, so it uses roundabout methods. Now, what's the likelihood of China facing a food crisis? Well, pretty high, given the disasters and other issues it's now facing. And now the other issue with this food crisis is whether it would be a long-term crisis or a short-term crisis. Many YouTubers focused on China believe it will be short-term, mainly because Chinese officials had confirmed in May that they bought food supplies for a year. Now, the focus has also been shifting to how the CCP is turning to guilting Chinese people during a time of crisis, with things like it's doing now by calling out the mukbang bloggers who film themselves eating large amounts of food, and by framing a campaign of food reserves as a campaign to stop overeating and food waste. Now, some popular Chinese YouTubers have also been critical of the CCP over this. They note that while the CCP is criticizing Chinese people for wasting food, much of the lavish spending and waste is coming from corrupt officials. And they're taking the discussion even beyond the issue of wasting food, to point to the CCP's policies of waste and abuse overall. Now, there's a bit of historical context to this as well. Mao Zedong, the former Communist Party leader, had a famous saying that, quote, "eating is a waste of food." And Mao's policies also led to mass famine in China. Now, a top CCP official and diplomat, Yangtze, published an article that gives an overall recap of how the CCP has framed its narratives on U.S.-China relations from World War II to the present. It gives some deeper insights into how the CCP plays with words in order to shift narratives. Now, it covers all the main conflicts between the United States and China. It frames the U.S. as the aggressor in each. This includes the Korean War, which it calls the resistance to the U.S. aid to North Korea. The Vietnam War, that the CCP calls, quote, resistance to U.S. aid to Vietnam, and among other conflicts. Now, Yang praises U.S. leaders like Kissinger, Nixon, and Carter, who benefited the CCP, and he frames them as having looked past the differences between the U.S. and China. And at the same time, he repeats his heavy criticisms of the Trump administration, although he comes short of naming any of them directly. The idea here is that any official who looked past the CCP's abuses of its people in order to work for the benefits of the CCP is considered good within this narrative. And anyone who stands up to the CCP's abuses in this narrative is considered evil. Now, the article stated that some, quote, anti-China forces in the United States have been using national security as an excuse to, quote, deliberately obstruct normal U.S.-China exchanges and to, quote, deliberately mislead the American people in an attempt to cause irreversible damage to relations between the countries. Now, he called the U.S. policy on China right now an all-out failure of the U.S. policy of engagement with China. Now, what are we seeing here? An important point to understand before we go into any of this is how disinformation works. One of its main methods is to alter the footnotes of arguments. The Chinese Communist Party, the Soviet Union use the same tactics, and here's how it works. They will tell 1,000 lies. Those 1,000 lies are used to create a single narrative, and that single narrative is used as one of the points to draw additional narratives. If you want to disprove, say, the new surface narrative, you need to go back and disprove 1,000 different lies. It becomes very difficult to do so. And when it comes to pushing narratives like this, that's what the CCP is doing. They have lies on top of lies about their history, miscommunications about the context of information, for example, how it frames its abuses of its people and the U.S. reactions to that. And now on that note, something to consider is that by putting Trump in the position of a historical sinner, what is the article trying to do? And is this a sign of possibly more yet to come? Who is the target audience of this article? Now, on the surface level, this article is a soft rhetoric that calls for engagement between the U.S. and China, while reminiscing about the friendship between the two countries. The CCP is masterful at justifying its failures at governing China and on shifting that blame onto other countries and other individuals. And the brainwashing effect that it uses in this never stops with a single purpose. It always tries to achieve all the goals at once when it comes to pushing its interests, to stir up hate in the Chinese people towards the U.S., to stir up hate in the American people towards their own administration, and to give Trump a warning that he should back down on his positions against the CCP. Now, on this note as well, the Chinese Communist Party only wants to negotiate on its own terms. Anything else is called a failure to engage with China. So, for example, if a country is unhappy with the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is stealing intellectual property from them, it cannot call the CCP out directly if the Chinese Communist Party wants to engage with them on these, say, peaceful terms. If a country is, for example, facing abuses of the CCP, where it's using, say, subversive tactics to get into its universities, and is using that to steal information from research programs, if a country were to go against that, the CCP would call that hostilities and a break from norms. This is an example of how the CCP demands different countries tolerate its abuses of them and not say anything about it, or it risks, for example, a diplomatic break. Now, the century of humiliation narrative is used by the CCP to rebrand Chinese history and to rebrand the nature of the CCP's takeover of the country. It, for example, paints China as being a country that was under assault from many different countries at the same time. It paints it as a backward country that still believed in religion, what it would call superstition. It paints it as, for example, having all these old ways of thinking that were leading it to be vulnerable to outside attacks. And then it brands the Chinese Communist Party as the savior from above who changed that situation and is responsible for all the technological advancements the rest of the world has seen. And now, many different scholars actually believe this narrative. And one of the ways the CCP uses it is that if you criticize the CCP, it says it hurts the feelings of the Chinese people because it brings up these feelings of the century of humiliation. This is one of the narratives it uses to justify its abuses. For example, during the time of Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party killed 50 million to 70 million Chinese people, and it is now continuing those abuses as we speak. And it uses this narrative to try to dissuade any criticism on that history or for its current abuses still ongoing again as we speak. The Chinese Communist Party commits acts of theft and subversion, willfully violates human rights, and acts with strong hostilities to other countries. And when any of these are called out again, it reacts in the way that Yang has done in this story. Now, in other news, President Donald Trump said in a phone interview with Fox News that the U.S. media has been bought off by China. He said, quote, "You ever notice they always say Russia, Russia, Russia? They don't mention China, 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 because most of these people, like you look at the NBA, they're bought off by China." And he added, quote, "China is, you know, the big pot of gold." So what's the reference of this? Now, several news outlets take money from China daily, which is a foreign mission of the CCP, again, a branch of the Chinese Communist Party, although it's a media entity. It uses this to publish its propaganda under these China Watch inserts, which many publications run. And in addition to this, parent companies and most of the big news outlets have deep financial ties with the Chinese Communist Party. And the CCP has leveraged this in the past to influence their coverage. For example, we can look at some of the issues that Bloomberg News had. Several years back, Bloomberg News criticized the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party responded to this by threatening to pull Bloomberg financial terminals out of China. And Bloomberg News at that time came out with a statement saying they would back down on their criticisms of the CCP. So the Chinese Communist Party uses roundabout ways to target the parent companies of these media entities or to influence them directly in order to alter the way they cover China. A lot of these media organizations will not cover what's really happening in China because of this. Now, in some related news, a large-scale Chinese propaganda campaign aimed at attacking President Donald Trump and his administration has been exposed in a new report from social media analysis company Graphica. Now, it dubbed the Chinese disinformation network, quote, "Spamouflage Dragon." And these organizations always like to come up with names like this. Now, it says the group began posting English-language videos to attack the Trump administration going back to June. And now, again, tying back to what we just discussed, Trump's statements on the media say calling out Russia, disinformation, influencing the elections, but not calling out China. Now, if this were to happen, this is an open propaganda campaign by the Chinese Communist Party to attack the Trump administration, basically doing exactly what Russia was accused of doing during the 2016 elections. And it's mostly crickets. Now, when it comes again to this disinformation campaign, they were posting to sites including YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and they were using fake accounts to upvote and spread these videos. It also used technology to create fake profile photos of many different racial backgrounds and had many different Western-sounding names. The report states the network was both active and prolific, but it actually had very little real-world engagement. It often worked as well by using hijacked or repurposed social media accounts, which are then used for, quote, "creating the impression of an organic community." Now again, this ties back to concerns of election interference. The Trump administration has been talking about the possibility that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to interfere in the new elections coming up. The CCP is also showing its hand when it comes to these different disinformation channels. The Chinese Communist Party is no longer being subtle with the way that it manipulates news organizations, with how it manipulates different types of social media platforms, with its 50-cent army, with its Confucius Institute, with different individuals it directly influences. And all these things are being exposed and rooted out right now when it comes to different initiatives being taken in the US and also in other countries around the world. Now, meanwhile, you may remember in a recent episode that we spoke with Jana Bianco, president of the American Bondholders Foundation, about the push to hold the CCP accountable for $1.6 trillion in unpaid bonds to the United States. Well, that campaign now has official backing. A resolution was introduced on August 13th by Republican Senators Martha McSally and Marsha Blackburn, calling for China to pay its debt to 20,000 American families. Now, the century-old debt was passed to the CCP, which took over China in 1949. The senators noted in the release that by holding the CCP accountable to this debt, it will also give the United States a pathway to sue the Chinese regime for its role in spreading the new coronavirus, the CCP virus. Now, what are we seeing here? Now, this could be used to wipe out America's debt to China. We've all heard the stories about China owns America. China owns America's debt, $1.1 trillion. China owes the United States $1.6 trillion, and it hasn't paid a penny on that. And so again, we could see this move forward. If the Trump administration were to take it up, if they were to actually push this, the U.S. could move this through without needing buy-in from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in. And also, if you want to support this channel, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to that in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile with that, also please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.